Hi boys. Just a few announcements to make before we get started with the class. Today we will be going over a number of passages from chapter 5 all the way to chapter 7. Okay. After that, you guys are going to open up the discussion board that I posted on Schoology, and you're going to be responsible for asking one question, either about the reading or the video that you've just watched. And then respond to one of your classmates' questions. Okay, that is due in before the end of today's period. Okay, for homework tonight, you guys are going to continue reading by reading chapter 8. In addition, I will have opened up a Schoology quiz. Okay, the room name for that Schoology quiz is Soma Holiday, all one word. Okay, and the quiz is on chapters 4 through 8. Okay. It's an open book graded quiz, so it's a great opportunity for you guys to raise your quiz grades. And you need to have completed that quiz before 8:30 tomorrow. Okay? So, read chapter 8 and complete the Socrative quiz by 8:30 tomorrow. Okay? So let's get on with the book. Okay? So we're in chapter 5. Okay? Part 2 of chapter 5. And we're only going to deal with this very quickly because we need to get on to chapter 6 and 7. But chapter 5 follows Bernard's Solidarity Service days. And by the way, if you need to take time to look for the passages, just pause in the video and find the passage. Okay, so it's one of Bernard's Solidarity Service days. Okay, which essentially seems to be a state-run orgy, right, with the intention of consolidating its citizens, of making them feel that they're part of a greater whole. Much in the same way that the sex education earlier on did that for or started that with the citizens when they were children. Okay, so Bernard attends it. It seems to be obligatory, and however, he's not into it at all. Okay, instead of feeling that he's part of some greater whole or some big or some sort of big being, as they call it, right? In fact, he feels more isolated than ever, right? We see that at the end when his neighbor says, "Wasn't it wonderful? Wasn't it simply wonderful?" She looked at Bernard with an expression of rapture, but of rapture in which there was no trace of agitation or excitement. For to be excited is to still be unsatisfied. Hers was a calm ecstasy of achieved consummation. The peace not of mere vacant satiety, of nothingness, but of balanced life, of energies at rest and in equilibrium. A rich and living peace. For the solidarity service had given as well as taken, drawn off only to replenish. She was full. She was made perfect. She was still more than merely herself. Didn't you think it was wonderful, she insisted, looking at Bernard's face with the supernaturally shining eyes. Yes, I thought it was wonderful. He lied and looked away. The sight of our transfigured face was at once an accusation and an ironical reminder of his own separateness. He was as miserably isolated now as he had been when the service began, more isolated by reason of his unreplenished emptiness, his dead satiety. Okay, so that ends chapter 5. Okay, Bernard is an individual, he's alone, but as we talked about in a previous class, he's alone he feels like an individual because of his deficiencies, not because of something, let's say, super abundant about him, like as we saw with Helmholtz. Okay, and everybody seems to see Bernard Marx's differences. Lena, at the beginning of part 1 of 6, says, "Odd, odd, odd," was Lena's verdict on Bernard Marx. And Henry calls him, as you guys rightly said in your questions, was a rhinoceros. In other words, his skin is so thick that conditioning does not properly work on him. Okay? Were it not for the fact that Bernard, who's an alpha plus psychologist, was so good at his job, it would seem he would have long ago been exiled or reprogrammed or whatever it is that they do to rhinoceroses. Okay. So anyway, Bernard takes Lenina out for a date. Okay. In that date, he keeps on saying that he wants to be alone, but alone to talk, right? Lelina obviously has no idea what he's talking about and asks, talking about what. Um, so, but the oddness of the date continues. At one point on their way back across the channel, Bernard stops the propeller and hovers his helicopter a few hundred feet above waves and wants to just take it all in and talk with her. Lelina, who is is appalled by this and calls it horrible. Okay, as it says here, Lelina, shrinking back from the window, she was appalled by the rushing emptiness of the night, by the black foam-flecked waters heaving beneath them, by the pale face of the moon, so haggard and distracted among the hastening clouds. Let's turn on the radio, quick! She reached for the dialing knob of the dashboard and turned it at random. Skies are blue inside you, sang 16 tremoling falsettos. The weather is always... Then Bernard switches it off. I want to look at it in peace, he says. One can't even look with that beastly noise going on. But it's lovely, and I don't want to look, she responds. But I do, he insisted. It makes me feel as though he hesitated, as though I were more of me, if you see what I mean. More on my own, not so completely a part of something else, not just a cell in the social body. Doesn't it make you feel like that, Lelina? But Lelina was crying. It's horrible, it's horrible. So obviously the date's not going all too well. Bernard Marx wants to talk and take in the sights, and Lelina just wants to watch sporting events, not talk, and go home with Bernard. Okay, and she does press him again and again to go back home so that they can go to bed. Bernard is reluctant, but eventually Lelina succeeds and takes him back home. Okay, but Bernard actually regrets it afterwards. Okay, so here we are where it says, well, Lena inquired. This is after they've had sex, and she's asking how it was. Okay, and this is an important conversation between Bernard and Lena. Okay, she says, well, Lena inquired with significant archness when they met next afternoon on the roof. Did you think it was fun yesterday? Bernard nodded. They climbed into the plane, a little jolt, and they went off. Everyone says I'm awfully pneumatic, said Lena reflectively, patting her own legs. Awfully. But there was an expression of pain in Bernard's eyes. Like meat, he was thinking. She looked up with a certain anxiety. But you don't think I'm too plump, do you? He shook his head. Like so much meat. Then Bernard starts to express his true feelings. All the same, he went on, after a little pause, I still rather wish it had all ended differently. Differently? Were there other endings? I didn't want it to end with our going to bed, he specified. Lelina was astonished. Not at once, not the first day. But then what? He began to talk a lot of incomprehensible and dangerous nonsense. Lelina did her best to stop the ears of her mind, but every now and then a phrase would insist on becoming audible. To try the effect of arresting our impulses, she heard him say. The words seemed to touch a spring in her mind. And then she says a hypnopletic platitude. Never put off till tomorrow the fun you can have today, she said gravely. Okay, the spring in her mind is an interesting touch, right? In other words, Lenina has become a machine, right? A machine due to her conditioning and due to the genetic programming. She's become a machine. But what's interesting about the passage is Bernard understands the point of arresting impulses. Okay, he later on says, we are adults intellectually and during work hours, he went on, but we are infants where feeling and desire are concerned. Okay, obviously Lindy doesn't understand. Bernard says, I know you don't. And that's why we went to bed together yesterday like infants, instead of being adults and waiting. Okay, so this conversation brings up the important metaphor from chapter 3, where human beings and their souls are said to be like water pipes under pressure, right? The state looks to poke as many holes as possible into that water pipe in order to weaken the soul of that human being, of their citizens. Okay, and if one were to arrest one's impulses, one would have a stronger soul or more powerful soul, right? The pipe would be under more pressure. To be an adult, then, to be a virtuous, free adult, seems to be one who arrests their impulses. Okay? Aldous Huxley seems to be predicting something significant here, right, in our modern world. Okay? A society that does not know how to arrest its impulses is an infantile one. Okay? Hookup culture, for example, right? Aldous Huxley would say is an infant's way of dealing with sex, not one of virtuous adults. Okay? So that ends part 1 of chapter 6. Okay? In part 2, Bernard visits the director in order to get permission to go onto, or a permit to go into the reservation in New Mexico. Okay? As it turns out, the director has actually been there many, many years ago, about 20 years ago. Okay? And he took a girl with her, a beta minus. Okay? And he remembers it to this day because he lost her. One night she went out of the tent, and despite trying to find her, she disappeared. Okay, and had to leave and return back to London without her. Okay, the director, in a rare moment of vulnerability, and seems to have shown that he was actually quite shaken about this. Okay, in the shame that he feels in having shown this kind of emotion, he blushes darkly and angrily turns to Bernard. Okay, and here we are at the beginning of a quote where it says, "And I should like to take this opportunity, Mr. Marks," he went on, "of saying that I'm not at all pleased with the reports I receive of your behavior outside of working hours. You may say that this is not my business, but it is. I have a good name of the center to think of. My workers must be above suspicion, particularly those of the higher castes. Alphas are so conditioned that they do not have to be infantile with their emotional behavior. But," he continues, "if I ever hear again of any lapse from the proper standard of infantile decorum, I shall ask for your transfers to the sub-center, preferably to Iceland." Okay? Now, as a mere threat, Bernard leaves this with a kind of a swagger, right? Thinking that he's a big man, giving the finger to the man, right? He does not, however, seem to be taking this threat as being something serious. Okay? So Bernard leaves with a kind of swagger, feeling as if he were heroic, if you will. Okay? So, part 3, Bernard sets off to New Mexico with Lenina. Okay? They're being shown around by the warden. Okay? But as he's being shown around, he remembers that he had he left on the eau de cologne tap in his bathroom, okay, which apparently is very expensive. So while the warden is giving his tour, he can't help but think about all the money that he's wasting. So he calls Helmholtz, his friend, telling Helmholtz that to do him a favor and turn off the tap. Helmholtz informs Bernard of something real. Okay. Helmholtz took this opportunity to tell him that the DHC, the director, had said in public yesterday evening. "What? He's looking out for someone to take my place?" Bernard's voice was agonized. "So it's actually decided? Did he mention Ireland?" "You say he did? Forward, Iceland." Bernard, now that it is a reality, is utterly dejected. All right? I'm going to be sent to Iceland. Okay? Often in the past, he had wondered what it would be like to be subjected, someless and with nothing but his own inward resources to rely on, to some great trial, some pain, some persecution. He had even longed for affliction. But as recently as a week ago in the director's office, he had imagined himself courageously resisting, stoically accepting suffering without a word. The director's threats had actually elated him, made him feel larger than life. But that, as he now realized, was because he had not taken the threats quite seriously. He had not believed that, when it came to the point, the DHC would ever do anything. Now that it looked as though the threats were really to be fulfilled, Bernard was appalled. Of that imagined stoicism, the theoretical courage, not a trace was left. Okay, and Bernard, now that he's actually met some adversity, and now that he's met, now that he is an individual that is alone outside of the society, he takes 4 tablets of soma. Okay, takes 4 tablets of soma. So anyway, they enter into the reservation, which is called Malpais, which is Spanish for Badland, okay, in New Mexico. Okay, and this reservation, gentlemen, is is of huge importance to our understanding of the novel, right? It actually is a kind of foil or antithesis to the civilized modern world, okay? The way you would seem to characterize it is that it's dirty, it's filthy, right? It's full of disease, age, death, suffering, right? There are old people that shock Lenina, okay? We see that in pretty early on in the chapter, okay? There are people with growths on their neck, right? There are mothers who are breastfeeding their children to the horror of Lenina, okay? In other words, yeah, again, this is a place of suffering, of death, of disease, okay? Huxley seems to go out of his way to give as much suffering as possible, okay? As you know, and in this way it is completely opposite to the civilized world, which is portrayed as the most pleasurable, the most happy, the cleanest place we can imagine, okay? Huxley seems to be representing here then natural man or pre-modern man, right? And Lenina has to, this is Lenina's reaction. But it's terrible, Lenina whispered. It's awful. We ought not to have come here. She felt in her pocket for her soma, only to discover that, by some unprecedented oversight, she had left the bottle down at the rest house. Bernard's pockets were also empty. Lenina was left to face the horrors of wild Pais unaided. They came crowding in on her thick and fast. The spectacle of two young women giving breast to their babies made her blush and turn away her face. She had never seen anything so indecent in her life. And what made it worse was that, instead of tactfully ignoring it, Bernard proceeded to make open comments on this revolting, viviparous scene, or viviparous. Ashamed now that the effects of the summer had worn off, of the weakness he had displayed that morning in the hotel, he went out of his way to show himself strong and unorthodox. Okay, so Lenina is horrified by all this, and Bernard continues to show his petty, small, resentful character in trying to show off to Lenina. Right? He boasts of being independent when it's convenient, but whenever it's hard, he's not up to the task. Okay. In their tour of the reservation, then they come across a kind of pagan ceremony in which a boy is asked to walk around a pit of snakes, all the while being whipped by a coyote man. Okay. Obviously, Lenina is terrified, right, by the blood and by the violence. Okay, this boy apparently walks around 6 times. Okay, while the drums are beating and Okay, obviously, I guess we should also juxtapose this ceremony with the orgy-porgy, as they call it, right, from chapter 5. Okay, but it's important that after the ceremony, we're introduced to John, who is a very important character in this book. Okay, and who will be the main focus of the next chapter. Okay, and these are our first words. These are his first words. Okay, I ought to have been there, the young man went on. Why wouldn't they let me be the sacrifice? In other words, why wouldn't they let him be the boy who walks around the snakes being whipped? Okay, I'd have gone round 10, 12, 15. Palotiwa only got as far as 7. They could have had twice as much blood from me. The multitudinous seas incarnadine. He flung out his arms in a lavish gesture, then despairingly let them fall again. But they wouldn't let me. They disliked me for my complexion. It's always been like that, always. Tears stood in the young man's eyes. He was ashamed and turned away. So we get a few things from this, right? First off, much like Bernard and Helmholtz, John here seems to be different from the rest of the society in which he lives. Okay, we also know that he seems to have read Shakespeare from this quote, "The multitudinous scenes incarnadine," which is a quote from Macbeth, and that he seems to have ambition, great ambition. Okay, and also wants to be a part of the reservation more than he is. Okay, so we're introduced to John. Okay, and then we're introduced to his mother, Linda. Okay, so here's a very important passage when it comes to Linda. Now, before I get into that, Linda apparently, she, according to Lenina, is worse than the old man that horrified Lenina, because she's never seen an old person before. Apparently Linda was so fat, and all the lines in her face, the flabbiness, the wrinkles, and the sagging cheeks, and the purplish blotches, and the red veins on her nose, the bloodshot eyes, and that neck, and the blanket she wore over her head, ragged and filthy. And under the brown sack-shaped tunic, those enormous breasts, the bulge of the stomach, the hips, oh, much worse than the old man, much worse. Okay, so Linda, John's mother, as we find out, was actually created and made and raised in the civilized world in London, okay, and has found herself somehow in the reservation. She's an alcoholic, right? In her attempt to get a high that is equivalent to that of soma, she's turned to tequila, mezcal, right, to make her a bloated, purplish blotched woman, right? And as it turns out, Linda is actually the director's ex-girlfriend, if you call it that. Okay. Apparently, Linda had come from the other place long ago, before John was born, with a man who was his father. Bernard pricked up his ears. She had gone walking alone in those mountains over there to the north, and fallen down a steep place and hurt her head. Go on, said Bernard excitedly. Some hunters from Malpais had found her and brought her to the pueblo. And as for the man who was his father, Linda had never seen him again. His name was Tomakin. Yes, Thomas was the director's first name. Okay, so Linda, this foul alcoholic woman, is actually the director's ex-girlfriend. And it turns out that, as Linda says later, John is the father of the director. Okay. Bernard obviously is very interested in this because he can use it as leverage against the director, who is now going to send him off to Iceland. John might be a way to embarrass the director in order to stay in London. Okay. So, gentlemen, Chapter 8 is very important because we get to learn about John as a character. Okay, so read it carefully tonight and do the quiz. Okay, once you've done that, turn it in. Okay, all right, I'll see you tomorrow. All right.